So you have a Sony ZV-1, you want to shoot better video. Let's talk about some of the settings that you want to have configured and just overall a few things on how to shoot better video with this fantastic pocket camera. So first of all, let's go ahead and power it up and take a look at our menu. I'm going to flip the screen around and we're going to go into the menu on this camera. Now first you need to be in video mode, so you may have to hit the mode button to get into video mode. You'll know you're in video mode because you'll see the audio monitoring probably, and you'll also see the little video icon in the top left hand corner. So let's go in the menu and tap to the top tab and over to Movie 1, and we'll take a look at our exposure mode. Now we have the ability to shoot in full manual mode, shutter aperture, shutter priority, aperture priority, and program auto. Now, of course, the camera also has a full automatic mode. One of the things to understand when it comes to getting great video quality is controlling your camera's settings. Cameras are getting really good at automatic mode and being able to properly expose a shot, but they're very susceptible to making settings changes that affects the overall look and feel of our video because those settings changes are ebbing and flowing, and we can usually see that in exposure changes, depth of field, and different things that take place and tend to interrupt the viewing experience. But manual control can be kind of hard because now we're in control of all of our camera settings, and if you don't understand how to set aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, then it could be a little bit tricky. If you want to learn how all of that works, you can check out my Sony ZV Ultimate Guide, which will teach you everything that there is to know about your camera. And then I also have a free course called Ditch Auto, which helps you get out of automatic mode by understanding how to control your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So in this video, I'm going to be in manual mode, mostly so that we can see all the different camera settings that are available. When we're in an automatic mode, some of the camera settings aren't available to us. So I'm going to be set in manual mode, but know that you don't have to be shooting in this mode to access most of the settings we're going to talk about. Under file format, I'm always going to be shooting in 4K on this little camera. This camera has a 1-inch sensor and it captures a pretty amazing image, but that image also is not very adaptable compared to some of the bigger cameras that have a more flexible image. And so I want to get the most that this camera has to offer, which means shooting in 4K. When I'm shooting in 4K mode, I also have record settings available to me. And in these record settings, I'm going to go with the highest quality setting that's available, which is 30p 100M. So that's 30p for the frame rate and 100 megabytes for the bit rate, which is going to produce the biggest file size with the most information. There's also 24p for 24 frames per second that also has the same bit rate, but by default, I typically want 30 frames per second, even though I'm probably going to be editing in 24 frames per second. In small pocket cameras like this, I definitely prefer to have more frames than less. Now, the Sony ZV-1 has decent autofocus, but it's not the best. At times, I found that the autofocus can be a little bit jittery or a little bit fast to respond, and so there are times when I may go into the AF drive speed and actually slow that down. If I'm shooting vlog style content, I typically do want the camera responding quickly because my arm is moving maybe closer or further away from my face, and so I might move it up to a fast autofocus speed just so that the camera is quickly responding to any movements that I make. But when I'm shooting things that are more stationary, it's often that I don't want the camera to be jerking around and the autofocus to be moving fast. I want something that feels more natural, so I'll go either with normal or maybe even slow, which doesn't slow down the responsiveness of the autofocus. It's simply going to slow down how fast it moves from what it was focused on to what it's now going to attempt to focus on. And then we also have AF tracking sensitivity as well, which is how sensitive the camera is going to be to different things that are going on. Sometimes you might find that the camera is too jumpy and it's jumping around to different subjects quickly, and you want your autofocus to be a bit more sticky, and that's where you might change it from responsive to standard. Now, with a small camera like this, controlling audio is very important. In my opinion, I would rather have better audio quality than better video quality. As long as I can hear everything and identify what's going on in the video picture, I'm fine. But when the audio quality is bad, I don't really care how good the picture quality is. It's just hard to get through. And so understanding that you can come in here and control your audio levels is pretty important. Right now, being that I'm behind the camera, you can see that my audio levels are pretty good. They're just above -12, but not jumping all the way over into the red area where our audio would begin to clip. And so it's important to kind of test your audio. You don't have a headphone jack on a camera like this, so it's important to be speaking to the camera. Now that I'm in front of the camera, you can see that the audio levels are a little bit higher than when I was behind the camera. I also have the windscreen on top of the camera as well, which is super useful when you are outside, even if there's not a lot of wind or no wind at all. If you are vlogging and walking and talking, wind is coming directly across the top of this camera and it produces wind noise. So I highly recommend using the windscreen to cover up this microphone so that way you aren't getting any wind noise that would take place by any movements that you're making. So set the audio levels and pay attention to your audio levels, because in different environments you may need to make adjustments based on what kind of background noise there is that you have to compete with. If you find that the windshield is not doing enough, we also have a wind noise reduction mode that we could turn on that gives us additional reduction of wind noise frequencies. This camera has digital stabilization with steady shot, and you can have it active, standard, or off. If you find that active is a little bit aggressive, you can drop down to standard. I find that active is good because I'm often handheld with this camera and I need the additional help. Another super useful option is the zoom setting for clear image zoom. We have optical zoom only, clear image zoom, and digital zoom. Optical zoom will only allow you to zoom as far as the optics of the lens will allow. Clear image zoom allows you to zoom a little bit beyond that, but it's a digital zoom without losing any picture quality. So it's great to be able to zoom beyond the capabilities of the lens on this camera, and you can go even beyond that with digital zoom, but as you go beyond the clear image zoom limits and go into full digital zoom, the quality of your image is going to start to deteriorate, just as it is on your smartphone when you go beyond the zoom range of whatever camera it is that you're using. I always leave my ZV-1 set to clear image zoom to give me just a little bit more. Now I also go into grid lines and I set the rule of thirds grid. The rule of thirds grid allows me overlays on my camera with the crosshairs here so that I can easily compose my shots. Whether I'm shooting myself in more of a traditional vlog or filming someone else, I want to be able to position my subject easily without having to think about it so that I don't have to do any cropping later. When I'm shooting a vlog, I'm typically trying to position myself in the middle with my eyes right along that top line. When I'm shooting things like a landscape, I might use these lines to position the horizon to better balance out my shot. If I'm shooting an interview, I might use the lines on the left or the right to position my subject to add a bit of negative space. So having the grid lines on just gives me a guide to better compose my shots without having to think too hard about it. Now, I don't like my camera making a ton of noise, so I set audio signals to shutter only, so that way when I am pressing down the shutter button a little bit to get autofocus, the camera is not beeping, but when I do press down the shutter button to take a picture, I get that audible feedback. Now, after making sure that everything that's on my SD card is backed up to a computer, I always format my SD card inside the camera. It's a better practice to do that and have the SD card formatted using the camera system than to format or erase your card on your computer. So one of the issues that I have that I always have to overcome when using this small camera is making sure that the autofocus stays locked on to what I want it to stay on. And that means going into the function menu and into focus area. You can see I have focus area lit up here, and choosing perhaps the flexible spot autofocus or the expand flexible spot. Now, the reason that I choose one of these is because instead of using the wide area, which I'm using right now, the entire sensor can be used to identify something to choose to focus on. And I don't necessarily want that on this camera. I want to choke that down a little bit. That might mean going to zone, which is smaller, just those boxes, and I can move these boxes around. It might mean choosing center autofocus, which just puts a box in the center, but of course that box can't be moved around. Or what's more useful for me is going to flexible spot or expand flexible spot. Now, what I like about flexible spot is it gives you a box that you can move all around the sensor, and it tells the camera only to autofocus what's within that box. And so if I am vlogging, so if I position that right there where I want my eyes to be, and I rotate the screen out, and I'm holding onto this camera, and I position my eyes right on that. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but if I position my eyes here on that, it's following my eyes and staying in focus right in that spot. You can see the eye detect autofocus is also doing a little bit of work, but I know that even if the eye detect autofocus falls off of my face, that it's going to default back to just looking from within that box. And that's going to result in having a sharp image all the time, because I know that the camera isn't going to try and focus on someone behind me because it sees maybe another set of eyes or something like that and decides to go with whatever's going on behind me. That happens often with small cameras like this, and to be honest, it happens often even with my bigger Sony cameras as well. And so I tend to either shoot with the flexible spot, and you can change the size of the flexible spot from small, medium to large. So nice small spot, or even get a little bit larger of a spot if you want a bigger focus area, or switching down to that flexible spot, which I feel works pretty much the same as the flexible spot. This focus mode just tells the camera that it's okay to go outside of the box a little bit, but the priority should be whatever is in the center of the box. Fantastic option with this camera is the fact that it has a built-in ND filter. And so I could switch that ND filter on and you'll see that it just made my screen extremely dark. Now you would want to use an ND filter when you're outdoors in brighter lit situations. Here's what your camera is going to try to do if you don't use an ND filter. If you have the ND filter turned off, so let's just go ahead and turn that off, what's going to happen when you're outdoors is your aperture is going to have to close down to limit the amount of light that comes into the camera. And that's going to increase the depth of field. That means that things that are behind your subject, whether that subject is you or somebody else, are going to be more in focus. You're not going to have as much of that focus fall off that's really attractive but hard to achieve unless you have something like an ND filter on your camera. It also might mean that your shutter speed will have to go up, and so you'll have to have a faster shutter speed, which can make your image feel a bit sharper. I prefer to have a little bit of natural motion blur in my shot, which means shooting at the standard 2 times the frame rate. So being that I am shooting at 30p, I want 1/60th of a second. If I was shooting at 24p, I would want around 1/48th of a second, which this camera only jumps in 10 increments, and so we'd have to go with 1/50th. But unless I absolutely have to, I don't want to shoot video at 1/200th of a second. I want some of that natural motion blur, so I want the camera to be at 1/60th. I want to have as wide of an aperture as possible while still giving me proper exposure, and when you're shooting outside in brighter situations, that ND filter is going to help so much. And you could use the ND filter for shooting photos as well. It works in both video and photo mode. So let's talk about actual camera settings. If you're wanting to shoot in manual or one of the manual assist modes like aperture or shutter priority, for video, I recommend your shutter speed being 2 times your frame rate. So in this setup here, 30p means 1/60th. If you're in bright situations outdoors, you can go with as low of an ISO as possible, perhaps even setting your ISO to automatic, because you're not going to have to worry about the camera boosting your ISO so high that you start to lose image quality. When that ISO number starts to get really high, it's boosting the sensitivity of the sensor beyond what the sensor is capable of capturing, and you start to see a lot of image noise, which is undesirable and definitely hard to get rid of in video. When it comes to your aperture, you want most likely as shallow a depth of field as you can get away with without making the background so blurry that you have no idea where your subject is. You should use the aperture not only to get proper exposure, but also to separate your subject from the background a little bit. You want that separation of your subject from the background, but you don't want your background to be so blurry that you can't tell where your subject is. That can definitely be distracting. And all shooting situations and environments are definitely going to be different. So when it comes to camera settings, practice makes perfect. Now I hope you learned a few things about your ZV-1 that will lead to you shooting better photos and better video. But if you want to understand the ins and outs of this camera completely, make sure to check out my ultimate guide, which is linked down in the description below. If you have any questions, ask down in the comment section. If you found this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I hope to see you back in another one soon. Take care.